Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
We're here with screenwriter and author Mark O'Connell to talk to him a little bit about his expertise in the world of UFOs and science fiction. How you doing today, Mark?
I'm great, Mike. Thanks. How are you?
I'm having it's a warm spell up in Minneapolis this week, so it's an absolute delight to me. We're just above freezing, so it's
nice.
It is a great Monday for me. So just to let the listeners know, this is a particular treat for me. Now, I haven't met Mark before, but I knew his parents, and he's from the same hometown, Big Bend, Wisconsin, that metropolis of the macabre. That Allison, who you guys have heard on the podcast before, from Milwaukee Ghosts, and I are from too. And I knew Mark's parents through church and everything like that. And so to get to find another explorer into the realms of the unknown from a town of 1,300 people is certainly a delight. And so Mark, you grew up in Big Bend, and what were some of your favorite sci-fi stories and authors when you'd grown up?
Oh, boy. The big ones would probably have been Isaac Asimov's Foundation series.
Oh, yeah.
Philip Jose Farmer's Riverworld series, which I've actually just been rereading recently. Anything of Arthur C. Clarke, anything of Ray Bradbury, anything by Jack Chalker and Alfred Bester. Alfred Bester was one of my favorites. The Star's My Destination. Mm-hmm. And what's the title of the other one? Oh, it'll come to me.
Sure.
But those are a sample. And the funny thing is, my first access to all of those books was at the Big Bend Village Library. What do you remember, Mike, of the Big Bend Village Library?
I remember a room, and I think the first book I got out of there was a James Bond novel. I think it was the original Ian Fleming version of Goldfinger. And then my mother was like, I don't know. I think those books are more sexual than the movies. And I don't know if you should be reading that. And then I read it, and it was, and I thought it was great. But the Big Bend Village Library, absolutely. The Big Bend School Library, the elementary school, had tons of weird stuff that I would pick up. There was they had plenty from this author Daniel Cohen, he was like the young adult paranormal writer when I was growing up. So I think I read and reread every single one of his books like 30 times, like witchcraft in the 17th century, UFO stuff, ghost stories, and so no, from the Big Bend Village Library and the Big Bend Elementary School Library, I read them out of occult stuff, and I had to go eventually to the Waukesha Public Library. I had to do the upgrade to the Waukesha Public Library. Number one, because they had more occult books. Number two, because they had more Doctor Who books, and that was
fun. Of course. Well, I went to the Catholic grade school in Big Bend, and our library there was about the size of a small closet. So that didn't help me much. But the village library, my mom worked as a volunteer librarian there for many years, and a lot of times she would take me with her to the library. And I don't remember if it was because she didn't have anyone to watch me or if it was because I wanted to go with her. The reasons are a little murky now, but I would spend a lot of long nights at the Big Bend Village Library, and you go through a lot of books.
Right.
On some of those long nights. And the two sections of the library that always attracted me were books about cars. I've always been a car guy.
Okay.
But then they had a little corner or a little shelf that had a few books about UFOs and Bigfoot and the Bermuda Triangle. And I just zeroed in on those books and just devoured them. So that's kind of where it all starts, is from that one little bookshelf in the Big Bend Village Library that had things like Chariots of the Gods and Frank Edwards' early UFO books. Yeah, all sorts of crazy stuff, and I love that. I love those books.
No, me too. And when you say Chariots of the Gods, funny enough, that was one that was on my father's bookshelf.
Oh.
And so Chariots of the Gods made me think that. So your father was also so my dad was a public school science teacher, and that was the same thing with your father, right? Like my dad took your dad's position.
Yeah, Dad was not a science teacher. He was an English teacher and for a lot of his career just an elementary school teacher. So he taught everything. Okay,
I see. I was gonna say, like, is the exposure to science? Well, probably the exposure to education is one thing that I find in a lot of people who are into the unexplained.
Yeah, absolutely. There were always books in our house. That we all made use of the library as often as we could. So yeah, we were a very literate family and a very literate household, and learning was everything.
So when did you start exploring writing yourself? When you did the reading, and when did you start? What was your first short story?
It was probably, I remember the first short story I remember was something I wrote in college. I was going to the University of Southern California. I was only there a very short time, but I made the most of my time there. And one of the classes I was taking was literally the history of entertainment. And it was just an incredibly fun course. It met once a week on Wednesday night at this nightclub in downtown LA. And the teacher brought in the most amazing guests. I mean, they were all sorts of vaudevillians and movie and TV actors and entertainers. And one week, he announced that at our next class, Ray Bradbury was going to come and give a talk.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, I just flipped out. I thought, I cannot let this opportunity go to waste. So I had an idea for a short story. I wrote it in the course of probably a couple hours, because I thought, okay, he is going to be looking for any reason to not read my story.
Of course.
So if I want to get a story in front of him, I better make it short. I better make it really short. So I wrote about a 3-page science fiction story. And when Wednesday night came around and it was time for the class, Ray just, it was a kind of class where the instructor would just sit up front and have a discussion, just have a long rambling conversation with the guests. So Ray just talked and told all sorts of anecdotes about his career and his writing. And it was wonderful. It was just a wonderful night. And then when the class was over, I went up to him and I just said, Mr. Bradbury, I wonder if I wrote a story. I wonder if you would take a look at it. And there was just this moment, this look that flashed across his face where, he kind of cringed a little.
Of course.
But he was such a nice guy. He didn't want to put me off. And he said, I would love it, but you'd have to give it to me with a self-addressed envelope. Well, it just so happened that in my mail that day, I had gotten a big, 8.5 by 11 size manila envelope in the mail addressed to me. And God knows what was in it, but
right, who cares? You had it.
I had just happened to slip the story into that envelope to carry it to the class.
Oh yeah.
So as soon as he said that, I said, "Oh, here you go." And he kind of his face kind of fell for a second, like, "Damn, he got me." So he took the story and he was really nice about it. And then a couple days later, I found out that he was actually appearing somewhere on the USC campus. And so I just made sure I was outside that building. And when he came out, of course, he's, swarmed with all these admirers and fans. And I just kind of cut up to the front of the crowd and I just said, Mr. Bradbury, have you had a chance to read my story yet? And everybody just kind of looked at me like, who the hell are you?
Right, who is this?
And Ray looked at me for a second and he recognized me and he said, oh, yeah, I have. I'll get back to you on that. and sure enough, a couple days later, I got the story back in the mail with a nice little note from him saying, "Mark, I like this story. I think it's good enough to submit to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction." Which was an incredible thing to happen to, a 20-year-old aspiring writer.
Right.
So I did submit the story. It didn't sell. I think I submitted it to a couple different science fiction magazines. It didn't sell, and my guess was because it was too short and pretty underdeveloped. But what the hell? It was all the encouragement I needed to get a start.
Yeah, and I mean, what a fantastic story in that, one of the first short stories I wrote, I just got a little feedback from Ray Bradbury on it. Oh, just a little feedback from Ray Bradbury. That's cool. That's like me sending my, it's like, yeah, Mick Jagger worked on my song. It's like the second song I've ever done.
Right.
It's cool. Yeah, he just sang backgrounds. It's all right.
Yeah, we let him help out.
Yeah, he was in the next studio. But no, that's awesome. So that's really exciting. And, coming on to that, how did you obviously started submitting stories after that?
Well, it was while I was at USC that I took my first screenwriting class. Mm-hmm. I knew I wanted to be involved in making movies and TV shows. I hadn't really fully thought out how I wanted to be involved in that.
Sure.
But in that semester I was at USC, I took a screenwriting class, and it was the guy who taught the class was a really old school Hollywood screenwriter. He had worked in the Hollywood studio system, where he had been basically on a script writing assembly line.
Sure.
But he had kind of made a name for himself writing this crime drama in the 50s called The Naked City. And it was a big deal because it was the first time anybody had ever written a crime movie based on actual police files.
Okay.
So he really made a name for himself with that, and had a pretty distinguished career after that, and was fairly well known. Well, he taught our screenwriting class, and he didn't. My recollection is he never actually taught us anything. He just told a lot of stories about his career, which was wonderful. But the few actual writing assignments we did have were so much fun that I just got hooked, and I thought, okay, this is how I want to get into this industry as a writer.
Okay.
So that's where that seed was planted.
Awesome. And so obviously you had the interest in science fiction, had the interest in weird stuff, and had worked on, sci-fi short stories and everything. How did you break in to Star Trek: The Next Generation? Like, how did you submit to that? Did you have an agent? Were you just watching one day and you're like, I have an idea. I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna make it so. And then that is prestigious. And guys like me, that I remember, talking to your mom and dad at church, and they would just be like, well, and they'd be talking about, that, oh, yeah, Mark's got a script. And I'm like, holy crap. I was like 15, and I'm like, holy crap. Like, your kid from Big Bend is working on Star Trek, and it really blew my mind. And I found it inspirational as, like, look, it doesn't matter where you're from or what you're doing. Like, go out there and you work hard. Like, good things can happen. And so I always thought those stories were awesome. So that's why I'm kind of wondering, like, how did you get into that process a little bit?
Well, first of all, I'm really flattered that my success with Star Trek had that effect on you. Thanks for saying that.
Sure.
That makes me feel really great. Well, I'll just backtrack and go back to the mid-1960s when the original Star Trek series was on.
Oh, hell yeah.
It was on. That show came on. I was 6 years old when Star Trek premiered in 1966.
Okay.
I was already a science fiction geek by 6 years old, because I remember just being so thrilled that there was a new science fiction show coming on TV, and it was on. I distinctly remember that it was on NBC on Thursday nights from 6:30 to 7:30. And when I was 6 years old, my bedtime was 7 p.m. And I remember pleading with my mom, because she made the bedtime rules. I remember pleading with my mom to please let me stay up a half hour extra on Thursday nights just so I could watch Star Trek. And I guess she must have, because I watched the show when I was 6 and 7 and 8 and just fell in love with it.
Of course.
So fast forward to years later, and I was working with my first agent I was, let's see, I guess I was about 30. So this would have been 1990. Just signed on with my first agent in LA. And I was talking to her one day and she said, look, you know what you really need to do is write a spec script for Star Trek. Because she said they have this open door policy and it's a bonanza for writers who are just starting out.
Okay.
You don't need to have a track record for them to look at your work. So, you can't pass up this opportunity. And I said, well, that's brilliant. I'm a huge Star Trek fan. I'll do it. And what she said was true. In the 1990s, when Star Trek: The Next Generation was on the air, they had an open. They were smart enough to recognize that their fans had a lot of really good ideas.
Of course. And
so they just sort of opened up the mailbox and said, we will read any script that anybody sends us, because you never know where the next real find is going to come from.
Right. And these were the days before fan fiction, when people would be like, sending in scripts to like Kirk and Spock making out or something.
Right. Exactly. So I didn't need much more encouragement. So I wrote a spec script. Spec is just short for speculation. It just means, or speculative. It means that you're writing a script with no promise that anyone is going to buy it. You're just writing it on your own time and your own energy, and you're hoping for the best. Mm-hmm. So I wrote a script. For Next Generation, and in my script, it was very dark and philosophical. In my story, the entire crew of the Enterprise had lost the will to live, and they were all on this suicidal binge, and they were going to destroy the Enterprise, and no one would ever know what happened, except Data, the android. Data was the only person who wasn't affected by the phenomenon, and so he was the only person who could save the crew. Mm-hmm. But he couldn't figure out how to, because he couldn't understand how you could lose the will to live. So the whole script was all about Data sort of going to the dark side and trying to understand how people could actually not want to be alive. So that script impressed somebody at Star Trek. It took a long time. It took about 6 months from the time my agent submitted that script to the time we got word back. But they said, you really have an excellent grasp of the characters. We'd like you to pitch story ideas. So then I got the rule book. The rules were, I did not have to go out to California to pitch stories. They were happy to do it over the phone, which was great.
Okay.
They said you can pitch as many as 4 different stories and try to keep the pitches to around 10 or 15 minutes or so, because they didn't just want to hear a story idea. They wanted to hear how you would flesh it out and how you would tell the story with the beginning, the middle, and the end.
Sure.
And how you would involve their characters in the storyline. So you got 4 stories to pitch, but you only got one shot, because there were so many people in the pipeline that they could really only afford to give people one chance. And if you blew it, that was it. You were done.
Wow. So, no pressure.
Yeah, it was incredible. Man. So I spent a couple of months working up 4 stories. I was very proud of them. I was very excited about them. I did my pitch. I did it over the phone from my kitchen table. I was living in Monroe, Wisconsin at the time.
Oh, absolutely. I know Monroe very well.
Yeah, home of cheese days. So I did my first pitch, and I was pitching to one of the producers, a guy named Joe Minoski, who was really, really nice to deal with on the phone. And so I pitched my 4 stories. He batted them all down, and I thought, well, that's it. I had my chance, and I blew it. And the next thing I know, Joe is saying, okay, here's what I want you to do next time. I want you to focus on this. I want you to, stay away from that. I want you to tell this kind of story. And I interrupted him. I said, well, excuse me, what do you mean next time? Mm-hmm. I thought I only got one chance. And he said, well, that's the rule. But he said, I really like your stuff, so I want you to come back and try again. So I thought, well, all right.
Yeah, what the hell? Of course.
Again, that's all the encouragement I need. I'll come back. So I spent a couple more months, worked up 4 more stories. Same thing. They all got batted down, and I can't remember which producer it was the second time, but he batted down all 4 stories, but he said, but I like your stuff. Come back and try again when you got more stories. So this went on for like a ridiculous amount of time. This went on for about a year and a half.
But I mean, that just goes to, think about that, though. From the time you first submitted that spec script, you 6 months till you hear anything. And now now you're 2 years into the relationship.
Yeah.
And, not a dollar has been earned, nor a word has been filmed yet. And so just so people know, like, this stuff takes time.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to have unbelievable patience. So, and I didn't really, I had to learn it. I had to acquire, I had to develop my patience. So this goes on for a year and a half, where every 2 or 3 months I'm pitching 3 or 4 stories, usually 4. I wanted to make the most of everything. So, and they would get batted down, and the producer would say, "Oh my!" And in a pattern emerged. Very often they would reject a story because the producer would say, "I love your idea. Unfortunately, we already have another story in the works that's very similar to this. I wish I had heard your pitch first because I like your angle on the story a lot better than the one we bought. So I want you to come back." And so at this time I had pitched to Joe Menosky, I had pitched to Brannon Braga, I had pitched to Renee Echevarria, I had pitched to Ron Moore, who is now so legendary for his remake of Battlestar Galactica. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And they were all really great guys to work with, and all very encouraging. And what happened was, so finally after a year and a half, I had pitched some stories to Brannon Braga, and about two, and usually what would happen would be, I would pitch the stories, and they'd say, "Okay, I really like this one out of your bunch. I'm going to take this one upstairs to Michael Piller and see if we can get it through." And then they'd call me back maybe a month later and say, "Mark, sorry, Michael didn't like this one, so come back and try again." So I was aware that there was this next step where the story had to get beyond the writer producer I was pitching to. It had to go upstairs to Michael Piller to get his approval, and if Michael liked it, boom, then you were in.
Okay.
So I pitched these 4 stories to Brannon. This was like in the spring of 90, I guess it must have been 94. And 2 weeks later, I get a phone call from Brannon. And he says, "Mark, we have an emergency. I really need your help." He said, "We just had a script thrown out. Michael just decided he hated the script and he threw it out, which means we need a new completed script in 6 days."
Oh.
And he said, "I really want to use your Timescape story. The problem is, with only 6 days, we can't hire you to write the story or the script. So you won't get screen credit. We'll pay you for it. And I guarantee you will get more opportunities in the future." So, what was I going to say? Okay, sure. Let's do it.
Of course.
So essentially, they purchased one sentence from me. They purchased the core of the story idea, which was really just a visual, and it was that Picard returns to the Enterprise from some away mission and finds that the Enterprise and a Romulan spaceship are both frozen in time, but they've been frozen in time in the heat of battle, and the Romulan ship has just fired what will be the death blow to the Enterprise. So Picard has to untie this knot. He has to try to get time moving again to save the Enterprise, but he knows that the second he does, the Enterprise will be destroyed.
Yeah, it's all over.
Yeah, so that was the idea they bought. They paid me $1,750 for it, which is still probably word for word the best money I've ever made as a writer. and then Brannon just took it over, and he wrote the script in 6 days, and just did a fantastic job with it. The episode is called Timescape. It's from season 6 of Next Generation. And what Brannon did was the story was complicated to begin with that I had pitched him, and he just made it 10 times more complicated, I was kind of amazed that he was able to do that, since he only had the 6 days to write the script.
Right.
But he did an amazing job. He made the story really complicated and really full of surprises and really fun. And I thought it turned out really well. And sure enough, 6 weeks later, I'm doing my first pitch to their new show, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and I sold a story, and wrote the script and got my first screen credit and my first episode that I wrote on the air. So, so Brandon was right. I did get a better opportunity shortly thereafter.
And that's pretty awesome. And also, even though your one sentence gets to be, part of the legacy of, one of the greatest science fiction series of all time. So that's pretty exciting. And then it gets you into Deep Space Nine, which, it's pretty awesome in its own right. And
and just recently, Playboy, a writer for Playboy magazine, took on the monumental task of watching all 700 episodes of Star Trek, including the animated series.
That I feel bad for him for that one.
Yeah, and ranking them all in order, all 700 episodes, best to worst. And that Next Generation episode, Timescape, it ranked somewhere right around in the middle of the 700, but the reviewer said, and I loved him for this, he said, this is probably the most far out episode of Next Generation that they ever did. So I was pretty proud of that.
Nice, of course. And no, I read that on your blog. And how did your DS9 episodes fare?
It was kind of a mixed bag. The first episode I did was a second season episode called Second Sight. I guess it was. I think I sold it during the first season, but the episode aired during the second season.
Okay.
That's how it went out. And so the process is, if they like your pitch, then in the normal course of events, they do it a step at a time. If they like your pitch, then they will hire you to write the story. And to do that, you have to spend some time you have to take notes from the producers, and they say, here's what we want to see in the story. And they want that story document to be maybe 10 or 15 pages. And they really want to see you flesh it out in great detail. They want to see how the events of the story involve and affect their characters. What do their characters have at stake in your story? That's what you really have to sell them on. So they buy the story for X number of dollars according to the Writers Guild scale,
right?
And then if they're happy with the job you did on the story treatment, then the final step is that they will hire you to write the script, and that's more of a month-long process. To do the story, you just have a matter of a couple days, probably less than a week to do that. If you're hired to do the script, then at that point I would go out to LA and spend 3 or 4 or 5 days at Paramount with the writers and producers, just in story session. They call it a story break, and they would take the story and break it down into the teaser and the 5 acts, and just break it down beat by beat. Here's the teaser. Here's where it takes place. Here are the characters who are present. This is what they're talking about. This is what's going on. This is how the scene ends. Boom. That leads into the next scene. Here's what's happening here.
So if they're going to use it, you get to come out and work in the room with the producers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, which was phenomenal. It was so much fun. I can't even tell you. So for Second Sight, so this was my first experience. I go out. We spend, like I say, it was between 3 and 5 days. I don't remember. It was different each time. But we would break the story, and then they would send me home, and I would have 2 weeks to write the script, but which sounds like an incredibly stressful amount of time, and it is. But after all the work you've done breaking down the story, it's not that hard, because
it's just details from then on.
Yeah,
right?
you have this very detailed structure that you can follow, a very detailed roadmap. You never have to sit and wonder, okay, what happens next, because you've already worked that out. So you just get to do the fun writing for 2 weeks, and it's a blast. And then I would submit the script to them after 2 weeks, and then they would invariably, one of the writers, usually the showrunner, who at that time was Michael Piller, would do the final rewrite on the script. So you always get rewritten. You can submit the most incredible script ever written by anyone in the history of the universe, and they're still going to rewrite it, just because that is the showrunner's prerogative, and it's his or her world. So
right.
He or she gets the final say as to what actually goes in front of the cameras. So So that was a big lesson to learn, was that they were, no matter how good my stuff was, they were going to change it. In fact, at one point I had a funny conversation with, by the end of the run of Deep Space Nine, Ira Steven Behr was the showrunner.
Right.
And I had a conversation, and Ira is just a hilarious guy. I had a conversation with him, and I said, okay, so would you please finally explain this to me? I've done some scripts for you where you've loved the script. I've done some scripts for you where you've hated the script. And in either case, they both get rewritten to the same degree. And I said, why? And Ira just shook his head and he said, Mark, he said, all we ask of a writer is that they get it to the 50-yard line, and then we'll take it the rest of the way. And I said, so I can give you my best effort or my worst effort, and it doesn't really matter. It's good. You're going to pay me the same amount of money, and the result is always going to be the same. And Ira would just shrug and say, "That's Hollyweird, Mark."
Yep.
So that was a really interesting lesson, And I guess if I had really wanted to take it to the extreme, I could have just said, "Well, all right, you're only going to get half my efforts from here on out." But of course, I never did that.
What was your favorite character to write for? Who was your favorite character to write for? Like the most fun, like the voice that you think that you could capture the most easily?
I always had an affinity for Chief O'Brien, and I couldn't even tell you why. I love the work of Cullen Meany. I thought he was a great actor.
Yes. And
I thought he was one of the characters who this was an idiosyncrasy of Star Trek that I never got used to. They the producers did not want you to write anything funny for the characters. Every time I tried it, I would get batted down. They would say, "No, you can't have Cisco say something funny. That's what we have Quark for." And I'd be like, "Really? So out of your 7 main characters, only one of them can ever say or do anything funny?"
Right.
Yeah, that was pretty much the rule. But so I guess one of the things I liked about Chief O'Brien was he was a character who could you could get away with a little fun stuff with him. And I couldn't even tell you why, but there was just something about that character and that actor that, I think he was able to put a little sly humor into things, probably better than some of the other people on the show. So I would say O'Brien was my favorite.
And his performance was always, he always had a great performance. I mean,
yeah.
Star Trek kept him employed for how many years?
Good long time.
He was on both shows, him and Worf.
Yeah.
Were there any particular changes that they did to any of your scripts that were like, oh man, I can't believe they changed this? Like, anything that changed that you felt affected the original idea of the story to a point that annoyed you? Yeah.
And it's a very, very specific example. I never figured out where this came from, but I always imagine it came from Michael Piller, who was, as I said, he was the showrunner for most of The Next Generation and for most of the first probably 3 or 4 seasons of Deep Space Nine before he went off to do his own stuff.
Right, he was the overlord for years.
Yeah, he aside from Rick Berman, he was the great bird of the galaxy after Roddenberry passed away. But yeah, there were my second episode for Deep Space Nine, because they were all very happy with the job I had done on Second Sight, my first Deep Space Nine episode. So they gave me, I can never figure out if this was meant as a test or a really bad joke or what, but they had a story that they had bought from an intern, and they basically had committed themselves somehow into going ahead and writing a script from this story and producing an episode from this story. The problem was nobody liked the story.
His dad must have been a producer or somebody.
I could never figure out what the deal was, but I don't even want to speculate because I just don't know. But none of the producers wanted to write the script, so they said, "Hey, let's get Mark to do it." So that was my first actual script assignment for Deep Space Nine, and the core idea of the story was they encounter a planet that only exists in our dimension for a few days, once every 60 or 80 years.
Oh, the Brigadoon.
Right, Brigadoon in outer space, exactly. And it's a lame story because there's just nothing you can do with it. there's nothing you can do with it. So the crux of the story that they had bought from this intern was that Jadzia Dax, the symbiont,
mm-hmm.
she falls in love with a dude from this planet and decides that when the planet shuffles off into its other dimension, she's going to go along with it. And so we won't see her for 60 years or whatever the time interval was. And, and we all know from page 1 that she's not going to do it. There's no way that you can actually build any interest or suspense in that kind of story. So I was, and that's why nobody wanted to write the script. So I got stuck with it. I felt that I had done a pretty good job. Here's what I did that I was happy with. The way the original story was envisioned was this planet that appeared every 60 years was very peaceful and idyllic, and it was and here's where I come back to Michael Pillars. I think Michael Piller just had this thing where he liked to imagine these pastoral alien societies where everyone wears loose-fitting pastel-covered tunics and they all live in adobe houses and they all have one name and everyone knows each other and they all talk to each other. Come for dinner tonight, my friend. I will make vegetable stew.
I think that sounds about like 25 or 30 alien planets that I remember from the shows.
Exactly my point. And it's insipid. I'm sorry, but it's insipid. And that was the way they wanted me to go with that planet. And I kind of refused to do it because I knew how awful it would be. So I mean, it was still a very low-tech society. There was really nothing I could do to reimagine, the nature of this world we were visiting. But I tried to make it just a little more interesting, tried to give the people a little bit of an edge, a little bit more character where they're not just being these kind of simpy people in tunics talking about vegetable stew. And it did not fly. It did not fly at all. Michael Piller hated the script. He also didn't. I kind of rubbed him the wrong way. That's a whole nother story. But he did not like the script. He just tossed the script in the wastebasket and they started all over again and just completely rewrote the script. A couple of my ideas, a couple of my lines of dialogue probably made it into the finished product. I don't even know because it's been so long since I've watched that episode because it's just not very good. It's not a good story because, as I said, there's nothing you can do with that main dramatic dilemma of will Dax go or will she stay? There's just nothing you can do with it.
She's never going to go to a low-tech society. Forget. And she's a serious regular, so it's not. I mean, obviously, they killed Tasha Yar, but that was the one surprise in 30 years of Star Trek.
Exactly.
No, of course, that was the innocent natives, the dances with wolves on the planet or whatever.
Exactly.
Is something that I remember all too well. But that's interesting that they had a specific, or Michael had a specific agenda of what he envisioned, and then you delivered something, and he's like, nope.
Yeah. Not even close, Mark. Not even close.
But that's got a little bit of a heartbreaker. I mean, I guess
it was.
As an artist, though, I think we're all used to our hearts get broken in little ways all the time.
It's the real heartbreaker of that story, though. Was with each episode, I would sort of be teamed up with one of the producers who would be sort of my guide and mentor through the process. Mm-hmm. So on that particular episode, which I titled Meridian, they kept my title at least. I called it Meridian because East meets West, blah blah blah, whatever. So they kept the title. So I was working with Renee Echevarria on that episode, and I always liked Renee a lot. He's just really a fantastic guy. And he loved my script. He really loved my script. And he just said, Mark, I would not be surprised if you get an offer of a staff job from this script.
Wow.
Yeah. So I was really pumped. My expectations were really high. And then he calls me back a couple days later and he's like, Mark, I don't know how to tell you this. But I just went into Michael Pillar's office and I said, well, what do you think about Mark's script? Isn't it great? And he said, Michael just looked at me without saying a word. He picked your script up and he dropped it in his wastebasket.
Oh.
That was that. So, yeah, it was pretty brutal.
That's They're not even pulling punches on the on telling you the story. It wasn't even like, you know what, Michael just said it just wasn't right, or you didn't capture the right voice or anything. He's just straight up like, no, he filed it in the round file.
Yeah, totally.
So no, that's great. And I could probably talk to you about a Star Trek all day, because I love hearing about these stories of the shows that I used to watch faithfully every week. Especially Deep Space Nine came out right when I was maybe a junior in high school. So I remember having a discussion with the guys on the forensics team. Like I was with the cool kids, obviously, in forensics. But so I remember having the discussion like the day after Deep Space Nine premiered. And just everybody's like, okay, it's on Channel 24 or something like that. Uh-huh. We're all just, talking about it, discussing it. We're like, well, is it going to be as good as Next Generation? Is it going to be, who do we like better? Cisco looks like a tough guy, blah, blah, blah. It just really was a fun thing. And so it's a delight to hear about a little bit of behind the scenes. But
well, it's fun to talk about. And I'll just put in one more thing about Star Trek before we move on.
Please do.
And so of the 5 episodes I did, 4 of them were Deep Space Nine episodes. And I've been really getting a kick out of lately, I'd say over the last 3 or 4 years or so, when I read new sort of critical reappraisals of Star Trek, a lot of commentators now point to Star Trek Deep Space Nine as the best of the bunch. Or maybe not the best, but sort of the deepest and darkest and meatiest in a lot of ways of all the Star Trek series, which I really appreciate.
Well, and I can see, because they could go deep into Bajoran culture in a way that you couldn't do when you're visiting a new planet every week.
Yeah, I mean, they dealt with some pretty heavy stuff, and they didn't flinch from it, and they had the actors, they had the performers who could pull it off, and yeah, they did a lot of great things with that show. Yeah,
and the Dominion War and like everything, like they had a chance to develop more. I mean, when you think of the original Star Trek, I mean, what was there, maybe 1 or 2 two-parters? I think only two-parter I can think of is the one they had with Captain Pike.
Yeah, The Cage. Yeah, I think you're right.
And Next Gen had a bunch of two-parters, but they kind of, I mean, that was it. So you had a 2-part episode where Deep Space Nine was allowed to bring a story out over the whole season.
Yeah.
And that, presages a lot of what we watch serialized shows today in a way that 25 years, even an episode of something of a high concept drama at the time, like Hill Street Blues or something, still you could watch it the next week and not know what happened the week before, and you'd be fine.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And try to do that with Lost. That's it. And I think Deep Space Nine was one of the first ones that allowed those kind of season-long arcs. And I know I never got into Babylon 5 as much as some of my friends absolutely loved it. And I did my time. But I think DS9 was the first one that really enabled that kind of depth in story. And so I think that's why people are saying it was one of the best of the bunch, because it was different. And it allowed to take time with the characters, and I think that's what's cool about it.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I'm proud of it. I'm proud of my work.
I think you should.
Despite Michael Piller in his wastebasket, I'm still proud of him.
Of course, I mean, because I don't think any writer or artist has a story. Nobody deals without rejection. Like that. That's part of the game. You go through, like, I think about how many times I played a show and I'm thinking I'm playing this great song, the show's going really well, and I look out in the crowd, I'm like, boy, I just delivered a great performance, and it's crickets. and you're looking at it, and then just somebody's like, play some Nickelback, jerk, and you're just oh no, like, great. And I'm stuck in Rock Island, Illinois, and somebody's throwing notes to say play Nickelback at me. What am I supposed to do? So everybody goes through those various kinds of things, and you're like, well, I'm proud of what I did, like, whether it worked or not, or whether it went through or not. And what I like is how your writing career has taken a turn. And Star Trek's awesome, but it exists in the land of fiction. And you've gone on to become a UFO investigator. And that's something, you've taken your interest and brought it up to the next level. And I'd just be interested in, how did you get involved with, because you work with MUFON, right?
Hi, it's Wendy. I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this, but the interview will continue on next week's episode. We're out of time today, so that's terrible. I know, I hate it when people cut the interview in half like that, but hopefully you're enjoying Mike and Mark's discussion, and look forward to next week on Wednesday when we release the second half of it. Thanks for listening, and you can find the show notes for today's episode at othersidepodcast.com/22.
For the song this week, we picked a track that we thought would be perfect for a discussion about Star Trek. Now, a couple years ago, NASA had a contest where they were looking for wake-up music for one of the missions. Well, this is the song we submitted to that contest. It didn't get picked, but we went back into the Wayback Machine and reworked and remixed it, especially for this podcast here. Hope you like it. This song is called Final Frontier.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.